This is Johnny Dosco. Stay tuned for another Score Sheet podcast. Holy Kadelka!
Hello and welcome to another Score Sheet podcast. I have Jason Martinez with me today of MLBDepthCharts.com. How are you, Jason?
Doing good, Jeff. How are you doing?
I'm doing excellent for a Monday. So Jason's got a site that, just like you'd expect from the name, talks about who's on every team's depth chart all the way down to single-A baseball. You want to tell us a little bit about your site?
Sure. I started the site a couple of years ago. I'm a big roster junkie. I've always been into who's the starting lineup of this team and the starting rotation, who's going to be the closer, and if a big trade goes down, if a big free agent gets signed, I want to look at that roster right away. I want to look at that new projected lineup and see how that looks to me. It's always been something I've been into since I was a kid. So I've always organized it in some way. I finally got it onto a computer and then onto an actual blog. Really tried to take it to another level, as often as I can, as far as adding new information. And a lot of the readers happen to be fantasy baseball fans, and that's something that I'm trying to appeal to now as well. From somebody who doesn't have a lot of experience in fantasy baseball, that's something I'm trying to add to the site as well, adding some more fantasy relevant content. But really, it's roster tracking all the way, and a lot of it is up to the minute. If a trade goes down, and actually this morning I was a little bit late because I was sleeping. Usually trades don't get announced this early in the morning, but Jeremy Guthrie was traded to the Rockies. I think he announced it himself on Twitter, which is probably why it came out so early. So I woke up, put the new projection on there for the Rockies, new projection for the Orioles. That's fun for me, and apparently a lot of other people like to use that information, especially for fantasy purposes.
Well, I think for fantasy, especially for Score Sheet, it's nice. If you're in a league that only has a few teams, 8, 10 teams, you're drafting from all 30 major league teams, you don't really need to know that much about who the backup shortstop is or who maybe is going to come up, because everybody's got the Pujols on their team. But for Score Sheet, where we traditionally have like 12 teams from a National League or 10 teams drafting AL only, you really need to know, if your shortstop gets hurt, who the backup's going to be and who the fifth starting pitchers are. So a site like yours, where you actually change the depth chart on a daily basis, really comes in handy once you start drafting.
Oh yeah, and when I think of a depth chart, I think traditionally a depth chart, you see just a list of names. And what I try to do, and what I'm still trying to do, and to get it to a point where somebody can see a depth chart and not only know if somebody gets hurt, if your shortstop gets hurt and he's out for 15 days, you might not necessarily call up your top shortstop prospect from the minors. You might call up this journeyman, 32-year-old who can just come in and play for a couple weeks here. On my depth charts, I would like to have that information where you can kind of look at it, and by seeing, you don't just see the name, you can see a prospect ranking, you can see statistics, you can see age and all that stuff. And right now I'm with MLB Depth Charts magazine, I'm able to show that a little bit more than on the website. But eventually I want to be able to show that on the site where you can just look at the depth chart and you see all that information, and it makes a lot more sense than just seeing a bunch of names in front of you. If you follow the game really close, you probably know some about these guys if you look at the names, but in a lot of cases, they're just names to you. You don't know who they are. You don't know how the organization feels about them, if they're top prospects, if they're the shortstop of the future or center fielder of the future. It's just names to you. So I think what I'm trying to do with the site is show you a lot more when you're looking at a depth chart.
Well, because you mentioned it briefly, along with just your website, you also have a magazine subscription, or kind of an Excel spreadsheet subscription that's incredibly cheap. But I know I get it from you now a couple, 3, 4 times a week, and it's got all sorts of information because it's just a big file that you can download and play around with.
Yeah, and that's, like I said, I'm not able to do a lot of that on the website yet, but by making it an Excel spreadsheet, you can, and it's just so easy to organize. You can add all the stats in there. I got age, how a player was acquired. You can add the salary, the contract, and in the Excel file, of course, it doesn't have to be printer friendly, so you can go as wide as you have to with the columns and add a ton of information. And I also have the PDF, which is more printer friendly, so it's more limited, but you can still see the stats there. You can see the projections, just the roster projections, just like on the site. But you can also see the players' age, stats, Baseball American, Baseball Prospectus, prospect rankings. You can do so much there. I'm having fun with it, and it's going well so far. I think a lot of people do like to have that stuff emailed to them, and being able to just open it at their at their convenience and print it out if they have to, especially when they're getting ready for the drafts. I think a lot of people like to have that information in front of them and organized.
Well, I like the way you put the depth chart and then the like you mentioned, the top 10 prospect list on the same. You just put a little number next to the guy's name because, you read John Sickles or something and he says, oh, this is the Royals' 5th best prospect. But if that's all you read, you have no idea whether he's also the 5th best third baseman on their team or if he's actually the next in line to be the starting third baseman. So the way you do it, you can kind of look at the depth chart and get an idea of whether this top prospect is blocked by Albert Pujols or whether he's got kind of a clear path to playing time.
Yeah, exactly. Like I said, it's just just like knowing how old a player is or his stats. If you see that ranking next to him, you really get an idea of who this guy is. If they're not even ranked and they're in AAA, it's probably not a guy who's going to make a lot of noise in the future. But I think if you see those guys coming up and you see he's ranked number 2 or number 3 by Baseball America or Baseball Prospectus, that's one guy that you have to keep an eye on. And if you're looking at the major league roster and your third baseman, for example, is not a big production guy, maybe an older guy, and you don't really have a set guy there, you can really go down to the minors and look at, okay, who's next in line here? Oh, we got the number 2 prospect in the organization here at AA. He might be coming here soon. So that information is important. Yeah,
there's a big difference between being, say, the top first base prospect for Texas, who has no real first baseman, or being their top shortstop prospect like Profer, where you're kind of blocked. And you might be good, but there's a guy in front of you that's already starting in the majors that's only like 24 years old himself.
Yeah, and that's where, for me, having the salary and the service time and all that stuff as part of a depth chart is so important as well. Because if you look at Profar and you could say, well, I think the kid's 18 or 19 years old. He's obviously one of the top prospects and shortstop prospects in baseball. But then they got Elvis Andrus up there, and he's a young guy as well. And you can say, well, we already have our shortstop here for the next several years, but that might not necessarily be the case. I think he's already 3 years into his service time. He could only be there 3 more years before he hits free agency, and by that time, maybe Profar will be ready to come up and take that job. So there's a lot that goes into it. Of course, they can always sign him to a contract extension. We never know what's going to happen with Profar down the line. But when you got one of the top shortstop prospects in baseball, it's good to think ahead, and especially when you follow a team closely. I think if you don't follow a team as closely, those guys don't matter. It's like, well, you're not going to see that guy for 3 or 4 years anyways. But really, those diehard fans really want to know, and especially, I guess, in fantasy these days, they're with the keeper leagues and they're drafting these guys and waiting 3 or 4 years for them to come up and be on their team later on. So it's important. All this stuff is really important.
Yeah, if you're in a competitive league these days with all the information that's available, and it's a keeper league with a minor league system and all. If you wait till a guy is tearing up AA to try to draft him, he's already gone in your league. You're not getting the Mike Trouts in the average score sheet league unless you get him in single A ball.
Exactly, and nobody knew who Profar was when he was signed out of wherever he was out of, and it probably took a year or two. But if you can find that, if you can read the scouting report or just read a little bit about this guy, and where somebody says this guy's going to be a star before he's ranked by Baseball America, or before anybody's even talking about him, of course you're going to get a jump on everybody, and that's really what these fantasy geeks in the deep keeper leagues are looking for. They're looking for these under the radar guys before anybody else hears about them.
Yeah. Well, switching to the major leagues, since you're a roster guy, what do you think of Miguel Cabrera moving back to third base?
If you don't think about the defensive part of it, you look at that lineup and you say, wow, that's the kind of lineup I like to see. I say, wow, I look at that lineup and I think that's going to be really fun to watch. If you're a pitcher on that team, yeah, that's a little scary.
Because their shortstop and second baseman aren't very good fielder. I mean, they're pretty much all around with Fielder at first and Cabrera at third and mediocre short and second. If you hit a ground ball against Detroit, you got a pretty good chance of getting on base.
I hope they're planning on outslugging some teams, and they probably could outslug a lot of teams. But when it comes down to it, especially when you're talking about the playoffs, and those games are so close, so you don't get a lot of slugfests in the playoffs. There's a lot of well-pitched games, and the defense makes a huge difference. So you got Miguel Cabrera at third, and you're sticking Ryan Rayburn over at second base, and Prince isn't that great at first. One mistake can cost you the game, and I think they're going to be okay during the season. Like I said, they're going to score a ton of runs. it's going to be interesting to see how he does over there at third. He's such a big. I mean, he's a big guy, and he's gotten a lot bigger in the last couple of years. So we'll see. And he has another couple of weeks here before spring training starts. I don't know if he had to gear it up with the off-season program to try to lose some more weight. Supposedly he's in pretty good shape, but I don't know. This is going to be it's going to be interesting to see what happens there. I don't know if they'll be able to stick with it throughout the season. It sounds like they're at least willing to try it.
Yeah, I mean, not only is their defense going to be bad and their pitching staff probably a little unhappy, but it seems like there's a mighty big injury risk by putting a guy at third base that hasn't played there in 4 or 5 years and is, he's not thin, like you said. He really doesn't look at all like a third baseman anymore.
When they first signed Prince, I thought, well, Miguel Cabrera is going to be the DH because, I mean, there's no other option there. And it's okay because they can fit him in there. They don't have, Victor Martinez is out for the year, so they're not really, it would make sense to put him in as a DH. But next year and in 2013, they'd have to figure out that problem. But, they'll give it a shot. I'm not sure how long it's going to last. I don't think it's going to last that long. I think maybe a month or two. Maybe they'll go more to Inge at third base, and we'll go with the good defender at third, and have Cabrera DH more often.
Yeah, well, I'm one of those lucky guys I actually traded with a buddy. I got Cabrera about 3-4 weeks ago. So I'm kind of hoping that he plays at least 20 games. It'd be fine with me if he played 20 games at third, which would qualify him at third for not only this year, but for next year in score sheet. And then they could move him back to first. That would, mean he's liable to be healthy. And I'd have the best of both worlds. I'd kind of have a guy that qualified. So that's my rooting interest.
Right, it was kind of a big deal, and that's the one thing I heard about right away is Cabrera going to be eligible for third base? And these are all the fantasy guys, and I was like, what do you care? And I figured out right away that that's very important. If he's eligible to be a third baseman, fantasy, that's kind of a big deal, and it boosts his value.
Oh, it boosts value hugely because it's a positional thing in fantasy. There's a dozen guys in American League that play first base that can pound the ball, especially now that Fielder and Pujols have gone over there. But third base is an entirely different story. The difference between a Miguel Cabrera and the third or fourth best hitting third baseman is just astronomical.
Definitely, if you look, there's so many first basemen who can do, not what Cabrera does, but pretty good. A lot better than what the average third baseman can do. So, yeah, definitely his value goes way up.
Yeah. Well, hey, it's been great chatting with you. And, folks, I highly recommend, especially if you're wondering who you should get to back up your third baseman or fifth starter or whatever, check out MLBDepthCharts.com, and you'll learn a lot. Thanks, Jason.
Thanks for having me on, Jeff.
All right.